Hello, good morning, heart-led leaders, especially yogis and athletes and anybody who loves being physical and being in their body today. This one's for you guys. I'm going to talk about why I don't stretch anymore on purpose. I don't intentionally stretch in my yoga class. When I take yoga classes and the teacher's instructing me to stretch, I don't usually follow the instructions. I kind of do my own thing a little bit. Although I might be doing the exact same posture as everybody else, I'm not doing it to experience stretching. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why and what I do instead, what I actually practice instead of practicing stretching. So, to give you just a little background, I started teaching yoga when I was 23 years old. I went to a 500-hour Bikram yoga teacher training in Los Angeles, and it was 9 weeks, super intense, a lot of stretching. And at that point, Bikram yoga was really the only yoga that I had done. So I was doing that since I was 19 years old, about 3-4 years before I went to my yoga training. Okay. And I used to be the stretch queen. Like I used to spend hours and hours of my life stretching. Okay. And I don't do that anymore. And so let's look a little bit now at what is stretching, okay? And what's the benefit? What benefit are people getting, was I getting from stretching? So stretching is kind of mechanically pulling on your muscle, right? And we only experience a stretch in a part of our bodies that's usually like tight. And by tight, I mean the muscle itself is being maintained short by your brain. It's actually a shortened muscle, right? That's what a tight muscle is. It's being kept in unconscious contraction by your brain. So we experience tight muscles, and then when we go to do an action that is asking that muscle to lengthen, we experience a stretch when that muscle is not really lengthening, it's tight. So say, for example, you have really tight hamstrings, right? The back of your legs is really tight. And so when you go to bend forward in a yoga class, you might experience a lot of stretching down the back of your legs just by bending over. That could be also an isolated incident. Maybe it's like that all the time, but it could also be, say, you went on a run or you did some kind of physical exertion that your muscle was doing a lot of contraction, whether you went to the gym or you went on a run, or maybe just, walking up a steep hill and your muscles were working really hard for a period of time. Now, our brains keep our muscles in contraction for some amount of time, depends on your nervous system and how quickly you downregulate from that contraction. But our brains will keep that muscle in contraction, which is why after your run the next day or after going to the gym, your muscles in that area feel tight. They feel a little shorter than usual. And when you go to do something, now you might experience stretch much more quickly. Okay. So that's what stretching is. Stretching is this asking the muscle to lengthen by doing an action or a movement. And what you're experiencing is the muscle not really lengthening, but stretching. Okay. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit further along in this talk. So that's stretching, right? And we do it unintentionally. Like if I had just done a lot of working out and swimming or something, and I went to reach into the cupboard, I might experience a stretch unintentionally in the side of my body because I reached my arm forward and these muscles were tight. Okay. But we also do it intentionally. We do it as a voluntary act. Like when you're in a yoga class or when, before you're going to go on a run, you might intentionally bend your body in such a way as to stretch out your tight muscles. Okay. So we do it involuntarily, but we also do it voluntarily. What's the benefit? What is the benefit to stretching that people are getting? Like, why would we do it? Right? Okay, the number one biggest benefit, and I'm not necessarily speaking for myself here, although this was true for me at one point, but I am speaking about the data, like the research that's available that says this is what stretching does, and this is the way it benefits people. Stretching releases endorphins in your brain. It feels good, okay? Not for everybody, but the people who are out there who like stretching, it feels good. And why does it do this? Because stretching is actually damaging our muscles a little bit. It's kind of like why we release endorphins when we run. We release endorphins in our brain during physical exertion, but also during stretching because we're causing damage to our body and it's actually painful. And so our brain will release endorphins to counteract that pain that would normally be showing up. Okay, so stretching hurts so good because it's actually releasing feel-good chemicals in your brain that are causing you to not feel the pain of maybe your joints or your ligaments being pulled on. Okay, so stretching feels good, and that's a legitimate benefit. It's a legitimate benefit if, like, say you've been having a really difficult day, or maybe something's been going on in your life, and you go take a yoga class, or you go do some physical, movement in your body, some of which might be stretching. Now you're getting feel-good chemicals in your brain that are helping to balance out whatever you were experiencing during your day. Okay, so that is the number one benefit to stretching. Like I said, not everybody experiences it this way, but a lot of people do, that stretching feels good. Okay, so given that there's a benefit to it, what is it that we want stretching to do beyond that? What is it we think that stretching does? And then what does it actually do? So now I'm going to kind of look at that, okay? We want stretching to lengthen our tight muscles. We want stretching to relieve tension in our muscles. That's what we want it to do. That's what we think it does. And I'm here to tell you that mechanically speaking, according to neuroscience, that is not actually what stretching does. We feel good, and we may not feel maybe the sensation of pain that we were having because when we're stretching, we have all those feel-good hormones running through our brain. But stretching, the actual sensation of it is not lengthening your muscle. I mean, mechanically, technically, it is lengthening, but it's not true lengthening of your muscle. Stretching, the actual sensation of it, is your muscle resisting length. Okay, so if we go back to that idea of your muscle is tight because you were swimming for 4 hours yesterday, and then you reach up to get something out of the cupboard and you feel an intense stretch right here, you're feeling that these muscles are not lengthening as they are supposed to when you reach your arm forward. They are staying short and they are resisting length. That is what the feeling of a stretch is your muscle resisting getting longer. Okay, so when we do that intentionally, when we go into a position that asks our really tight muscles to lengthen, and then we continue to push ourselves into that position, we're getting those feel-good hormones, but we're also forcing the muscle to lengthen. So that resistance to stretching, I'm going to break that down just a tiny bit in some neurophysiological terms. And this is actually something you can go Google and look up. It's a nervous system function that we have. It's called the stretch reflex, okay? And this is involuntary. It's a reflex. So it's not even happening like on purpose in our minds or in our brains. It literally happens at a spinal cord level, okay? That's what a reflex is. It just happens instantly, from some kind of sensory input or output, and then your spinal cord has a reaction, okay? So it's called the stretch reflex. You can look it up. It's part of our nervous system functioning. It's part of how we stand up and walk around, okay? But the stretch reflex is also part of what's happening when we are experiencing stretching or when we are stretching. And what's going on is that there's these little spindles inside our muscle fibers. Okay, so if my hand right here, these are the muscles, there's these little spindles inside the muscle fibers. And when our muscle gets stretched, when the muscle gets pulled on, these spindles respond to that sudden change in the muscle. And those spindles send a message instantly to your spinal cord telling that muscle, those muscle fibers, to contract. Okay, so your muscle is being mechanically lengthened by you, maybe bending forward in a yoga pose or doing any, type of movement that asks your tight muscle to lengthen. And when that happens, this spindle responds to the change in muscle length, the sudden change, by telling that muscle that you are stretching to shorten. That's literally what I mean when I say when stretching is not muscle lengthening, stretching is your muscle resisting length. That is what that feeling is. It's actually like a little bit like a tug of war. Okay. So we want stretching to be our muscle lengthening, but based on what I just described, it's actually your muscle shortening. It's actually your muscle shortening and not lengthening. Because if your muscle was lengthening, you wouldn't have that sensation. If I were to reach my arm forward and the muscles at the side of my waist were not tight, they were not contracting, I would not experience a stretch. I would simply experience my arm moving forward in space and these muscles naturally getting longer, and there wouldn't be much sensation there. We're experiencing a stretching sensation because the muscles are resisting length. Okay, so that's what stretching actually is, and what it actually does is it causes our muscles to contract. Okay, so this was huge information for me. I had no idea about this in the first 7 years of my yoga teaching. And when I found out about this, it was hard for me to swallow for a minute because I was like, but I love stretching. Stretching's so good. That's what I'm supposed to do. That's what, my basis of understanding yoga, that's what it's all about. And it's like I said, there's a benefit to it. I talked about a little bit earlier. We feel good. Some of us do, at least. Some people don't feel good, but some people feel good when they stretch. Okay, so that's a legitimate benefit. Now, the issue is it's not your muscle lengthening. It's actually causing your muscle to contract. So what does that mean if you have really habitually tight muscles? It means that while you're stretching, while you're in the yoga class, you may feel some temporary relief from that tight space because of all of the endorphins that are being released in your brain. But then immediately following, or the next day, you may find that the area that you stretched is actually tighter than it was the day before, right? That's what I experienced. And when you have an injury, or when you have like chronically tight muscles in your body and you're stretching them as a way to deal with them, it's kind of like a Band-Aid because it doesn't really address the issue, which is the muscle is chronically tight. And when the muscle is chronically tight and you're stretching it, you're simply making it a little bit tighter and a little bit tighter every time you stretch it. And if you've ever had an injury and you've gone taken yoga classes and you've stretched, there's a certain point where the stretching doesn't feel good and it actually hurts. And you notice that it doesn't seem to be helping you at all. It seems to be hurting you more. And then the teacher, might tell you to back off, or you might figure that out on your own, that you shouldn't stretch so deeply or you shouldn't push so hard, right? And that's definitely like what you should be doing because you don't want to overstretch and hurt yourself. So overstretching is basically getting that stretch reflex thing, the spinal cord reflex that I talked about earlier, into like a really strong reaction. Okay. And that's what a cramp is. That's what it is when we have like throw our back out or we overstretch and we injure ourselves. The muscle goes into hypercontraction to prevent us from moving very much so that the muscle does not tear or that the ligaments and the joints don't get pulled apart. Okay. So this stretch reflex thing, like I said, look it up. It's a nervous system functioning. I'm talking a little bit more about how it's like real time behaving or interacting with our experience and our bodies. But it's a super important thing that if I was doing a yoga teacher training, we'd definitely be talking about this. So going forward to what I don't do anymore, I don't stretch on purpose. First of all, I have another way of moving in my body that actually lengthens my tight muscles, lengthens them effectively, rather than kind of just making me feel something different in that area for a moment. There's a way, again, based on neurophysiology that I've been studying, that I've been trained in, Hanasomatic education, where we actually release the tight muscle. So I'll give you just a little example of what that is compared to stretching. So if stretching is mechanically pulling on your muscle, like if I stabilize one part of my body and then I use my strength to pull my body in the opposite direction to create a stretch, okay, that is the sensation I'm experiencing is my muscle resisting length. It's not actual lengthening, it's resistance to length, okay? That tension of stretching. What I do now in my Hanasomatic practice and what I teach is kind of like, have you ever seen those Chinese finger cuffs, where you put your fingers on each end and then when you pull on it, it gets tighter and you can't pull your fingers out? That's kind of what stretching's doing. It's resistance to stretch. Okay, what we do in Hanasomatic education is very much like this finger cuff analogy. In fact, I wish I had one with me. So in Hanasomatic education, we lengthen the tight muscle by going into a voluntary shortening of the muscle. And that then slowly lengthening the muscle. And if I had the finger cuffs now, my fingers would be free and the cuff would fall off. This is actually a way that our nervous system can not only change the tonicity in muscle, but unwind the tight muscle. So we go into a voluntary contraction of that tight muscle, and then we slowly come out. And then the muscle's gotten a little longer. And then we do it again. We go into a voluntary contraction of the muscle, and then we very slowly come out. It has to happen slowly, otherwise our spinal cord takes over and it becomes reflexive. It has to happen consciously. And so this is what I actually do now instead of stretching. I shorten the tight spaces in my body and then I slowly lengthen them. And I do that a number of times until my brain has changed the length of the muscle. And it is amazing. It's so wonderful. It feels really good. It doesn't have that same tension or pulling that you experience when you stretch. It feels good in a different way. It's not like a burst of chemicals. It's just relaxing. It's just soothing, right? So this is what I do now. And now that I practice this, and I've been practicing this for years, I don't have chronically tight muscles. Therefore, when I'm doing my yoga practice, I don't usually experience much stretching. I just experience going into the movements and my muscles get longer and my muscles get shorter, but I don't experience a lot of stretching. If I do, unintentionally go into a movement and I go, oh wow, I feel a lot of stretching on the outside of my hip or in the back of my neck. This is information for me about what muscles I need to actually release, not stretch, but shorten a little bit and then slowly come out. So when I teach a somatic yoga class, which I do teach somatic yoga, in fact, next week, same time, Friday, 9 a.m., I'm going to do a little demo of the stuff that I'm talking about today. And then later this month, there's going to be a full-length class that you guys will be invited to. So look out for that. But when I teach somatic yoga, first we work to relax and lengthen the chronically tight spaces in people's bodies. And then after their muscles are longer and more relaxed, then I invite them to do some yoga poses based on their own experience, their internal experience in their bodies, so that they know where their limit is and they only go so far as feels easy and comfortable for them. Okay. So when I teach somatic yoga, I'm not just showing people a pose that's going to cause them to experience a stretch. I'm asking them to lengthen through this method I just talked about, lengthen their tight muscles, and then actually go into the pose through their sensory experience from the inside so that they are connected to what's happening real time and they can modulate and make themselves as comfortable as possible. So this way of practicing yoga, it's so peaceful. It really does bring a lot more peace and ease into your yoga practice, whether you're a beginner, especially if you're a beginner, right? And often for beginners, yoga is painful. It's really uncomfortable. This makes it way more comfortable. But also for advanced practitioners who are more sensory aware of their bodies, this type of practice, which is much more slow and conscious, it brings so many juicy, interesting things to the surface of their subconscious, of their awareness in their body. So it really is kind of for all levels. But yeah, next week, this time, I'm going to give you guys a demo of the difference between stretching versus what I've just described that we do in Somatic Education, which is a contraction and slow release of musculature. So you guys will get an opportunity to try this out. So to recap, stretching, it feels good. That's the number one benefit. It actually releases feel-good chemicals in your brain. Okay, that's why people feel good when they do it. And if you're having a difficult time, stretching can be a source of relief and comfort because you feel good. Same way as when you run. Does stretching actually lengthen your muscles? It doesn't. It doesn't actually lengthen your muscles. It causes your muscles to actually go into contraction reflexively. That's what the sensation of stretching is. It's your muscle resisting length. As you are pulling on it and asking it to lengthen, the muscle itself is reflexively shortening. Okay? So, why would this be problematic? Because if your muscles are really chronically tight and then you're stretching them, they're going back into contraction and you may find yourself even tighter the next day. And then you stretch again and then you find yourself tighter the next day and you're in kind of a vicious cycle. Okay. What I do instead is something that not a lot of people know about, but super innovative based on neurophysiology, that is a way of actually lengthening, not stretching, but lengthening your tight muscles back to a more natural length. And then when you go to do that movement or that yoga pose, you're not experiencing stretching, you're simply experiencing the position, the length in your body, okay? And so I don't feel stretching or sensation as much anymore because my body's not as tight as it once was. So when I do my yoga, I don't really experience much stretching, and I don't try to, because I know that if I have a tight muscle, there's a much more effective way to ask and get that muscle to lengthen. So Little bit different, a little bit different way of interacting with your body, a different way of doing yoga. And like I said, if you're interested to try out some of this technique, I'll be sharing next week, Friday, 9 a.m., more about this technique. And then I'll be inviting you guys to a live Zoom class wherein you can try this with me and get the benefit. So, yeah, definitely let me know in the comments how this talk was for you, if you learned something new, if you have any questions about this. And stretch reflex, look it up. It's a nervous system functioning, and I described quite a bit about its impact on our bodies. But yeah, it's a really common culprit in muscle tension and pain, in cramping and soreness, and in yoga classes where you're not getting the result that you're trying to get through all your effort and your time and energy. You're trying to get longer muscles, you're trying to get more relaxed, and maybe that might not be happening for some of you. And so if this helps you understand why today, let me know. I'd love to have a dialogue and chat with you guys more about all of it. Okay. See you soon. Have a beautiful day. Bye.